Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We might have a few more people getting put into this breakout as we get going, but I'm going to let Jonathan have the most time possible to get through his presentation. So we're so pleased that we could have him here today. He was actually slated to be with us the last time we were supposed to do this in person. This was right as COVID took us out of commission for our last summit. So we're so pleased that he was able to join us this time and somewhat change up his presentation a little bit for us after all we have been through this year. So let me read just a little bit about Jonathan. He directs Housing Forward Virginia's research and program efforts across the Commonwealth. This work includes regional and local housing needs assessments, policy generation and implementation, and communication strategies. He specializes in telling stories about Virginia's housing challenges through data and regularly presents at conferences and events throughout the state. Jonathan has a master's in urban and regional planning from Virginia Commonwealth University, where he also teaches an introductory urban planning course. So Jonathan, welcome. Thank you again for being here, and we're going to let you take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Nadine. It is great to be here. Albeit about a full year later than what I expected, but that's okay. And it really does seem like just yesterday that I was planning to hop in the car and come up to the Valley to speak with all of you. But we'll do it virtually this time, and that's okay because it means we're safe. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a lot of different things that Nadine and her team have asked me to speak on. So I'm going to be covering a lot of different topics. I will be trying to give a 10,000-foot view about a lot of important stuff going on across the state that I think is really critical for you all to know about. And my goal, ideally, is to wrap up so that we have time for some discussion and that I get to hear from you all as the housing experts and practitioners in your community, in your part of the Commonwealth. I love hearing about what's going on, what opportunities, successes, challenges you guys are having, so that I can take them to other people and help develop a better understanding of housing needs across our great state. So Nadine already kind of talked about what we do and I do, but long story short, Housing Forward Virginia, you all are probably familiar with us in some way or another. We changed our name last year. We were Housing Virginia. We added Forward in there, and we changed our colors a little bit. So we have a fresh new identity now. But we basically are the think tank for affordable housing research and policy in the state. We're not an advocacy organization. We really help people understand and digest housing issues and housing policy. But we leave the lobbying and all that sort of stuff to other folks. So we just try to make sure people are educated and knowledgeable and informed. And we do that for housing advocates, for local planners, for state policymakers, basically everybody that intersects with housing and affordable housing policy in one way or another through their jobs or through their interests. So what I'll try to cover today is getting the big picture, what's happening at the national and state level, really at the state level. What are some trends that you all need to be aware of that you probably already are aware of? I'll try my best to layer in data from the Valley itself to kind of compare what's happening at the state level with what's happening in the Valley. And I also want to talk about COVID's impact on housing providers. We did a survey and some research of housing providers in the Richmond region back in April and May during the first phase of the pandemic. And so I'll share the results of that and share kind of what we've also heard from other practitioners across the state. And this is a place where I would love to hear from you towards the end of this hour about how COVID has impacted the delivery of housing services and housing production in your communities. And then I'll talk about what's going on here in Richmond. What are some big policy changes that have happened over the past couple of years and what's going on right now that you all should be aware of. So I think it's really important to remember that depending on who you ask, we are in the worst housing crisis that we've had since 2008, or we're in the best housing market we've ever had since 2008. And so it really depends on who you ask and what their housing position is, where they live and what's going on. you'll get a very different reaction, right? So we have a very bifurcated, very different housing market for owners and for renters. So let's talk about renters first. So in Virginia, the number of renters who have a housing cost burden, who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, the number of low-income renters below 80% of whatever their local or regional area median income is, that's increased by 16% over the past decade. So the latest data that we have from HUD that allows us to look at this data very easily by AMI is for 2017. It always kind of lags a little bit behind, but it's really good, really accurate data. And so we now have about 500,000 different low-income renter households that are paying too much for housing. And as you know, this means they have less money to pay for healthcare, to pay for transportation, to pay for childcare, preschool, all of that different stuff. And so households are put into a precarious financial position when they are paying too much for their homes. And so this rent burden, when we begin to dissect who is most affected by this burden, it's most prominent among people in household types that you would probably expect. So single persons, or kind of non-related households, or roommates living together, small families and large families. The cost burden share among everybody, all of these different family types is increased, but that burden is borne highest by those types of households across Virginia. And then when we dissect it by race and by ethnicity, extreme cost burden and cost burden overall is increasing for Hispanic, Latino, and Black renters. And in fact, for many of the other races in Virginia, their cost burdens on average have decreased a little bit. So we know that racial disparities in housing are extremely prevalent. The wounds that have been opened up over the past year have revealed this in more detail, and I'll talk a little bit about how that has affected some of the state level policy and research that is going on later on in the presentation. But needless to say, the housing situations for low income renters of color is not improving. So why is this? What's going on? First of all, there is an extremely low supply of apartments across the board, but especially at rents that are affordable. Whether or not those rents are produced by market conditions, what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is a term that I personally don't like, but has gotten into deeper into the conversation. Basically, housing that doesn't have a subsidy attached to it, but is affordable because of its location, quality, or other macroeconomic trends. That supply, both of capital A affordable and lowercase a affordable, has been dwindling relative to demand. We know also that there is over the past few decades, really since the 1980s, there is decreasing federal support for affordable rental housing relative to the increase in needs. And I'll talk a little bit about what that actually looks like on the ground. And so that support has been decreasing, especially for deeply affordable rental housing, but it's also changed a little bit. We know that the low-income housing tax credit program created in the 1980s changed the way that the federal government supports and creates assisted rental housing across the country. And today, the low-income housing tax credit program is the single largest producer of affordable units, but the process in which it does that is very different than the original public housing model from the 1930s and 40s and 50s. We know that localities aren't encouraging and permitting apartments at the level that the market is demanding. This gets into policy priorities and preferences by local supervisors and planning commissioners, and NIMBYism and exclusionary zoning are a huge part of this. So my colleague Erica will be talking this afternoon about that NIMBYism issue. And if you're curious about ways to tackle that at the local level and overcome that preponderance of kind of backlash against against renters and renter housing, definitely attend her session, which will be much more discussion oriented. And we also know that relative to housing cost, wages have not gone up, especially for people who aren't able to save and buy their own home. So, people like millennials in my generation that are straddled with student debt and maybe have not seen the wage growth that they need in order to pay down that student debt and save for a home, or are essential workers, people that are getting paid a decent wage but haven't seen their wages go up, and those wages just aren't enough to support home ownership. And I'll show you what home ownership opportunities look like and how those have dwindled over the past few years as well. So these are just some of the trends and some of the reasons why the situation for renters hasn't improved. And really, this doesn't even layer COVID into it and what's happened over the past year. And so that's a whole nother part of the equation that we need to think about is what happens when temporary rental assistance might expire and the eviction moratoriums expire at some point later this year. So that is a huge unknown that a lot of providers are struggling with. So what does the actual stock of assisted rental housing look like in Virginia? How has that changed over the past decade? As you can see, the increases in stock have been in the low-income housing tax credit units, so units that are produced through that program, which Virginia Housing, our state housing finance agency, supports with a federal allocation of tax credits. Those are awarded on a competitive basis to projects across the state. The supply of housing choice vouchers has gone up some as federal budgets have increased a little bit for that program. And so those vouchers provide a huge lifeline for renters to find housing in the market and be able to afford that housing. But we can see that the public housing stock and other HUD-assisted multifamily units have seen decreases over the past decade. And that's not necessarily because those units are completely disappearing, but it's because they are being repositioned and resubsidized through these other programs, through the tax credit program, taking away older project-based Section 8 units and putting them into the tax credit program, or taking public housing stock and using the rental assistance demonstration or RAD process to leverage other funding that's made available at the federal level. So at the end of the day, we've seen a slight increase in the number of assisted rental units across the state, but the type and targeting of those units is changing and will continue to change because of changes at the federal level in terms of what policies and what programs and what funding streams are available and promoted. So let's take a look at assisted rental housing stock in the Valley. So each little pane here in this graph shows one of the counties or localities in the Valley, and you can see the cumulative production of assisted rental housing over time from 1980 to the present. And so the bulk of the assisted rental housing in the Valley is actually in Shenandoah County, Harrisonburg, and Frederick County. And for the most part, that stock has been the most recent construction or rehab date for that stock has been in the past decade or two. So the stock in the Valley, at least from my perspective, looking at the data here, doesn't appear to be that old, but it's definitely a question to consider moving forward is as we reach 2030 and 2040, is the Valley and the housing providers and localities in the Shenandoah Valley, are they proactively thinking ahead about ways to preserve this affordable rental supply that uses tax credits or uses USDA rural development rental assistance, or maybe the public housing stock that might exist in Harrisonburg. So we have all these questions that we need to consider in the long term about proactively thinking about the preservation of this publicly assisted stock in the Valley. And then when we look at this the stock that has some sort of federal and or state subsidy or assistance attached to it, who is being served by this? Generally, it is low-income families who were earning definitely below 80% of the median income were probably much more likely below 60 and 50% of AMI. So for the most part, the funding streams attached with these homes, with these affordable apartments, are oriented to families and a general population. But we do have probably about 1,000 or a little over 1,000 units in the Valley that are targeted specifically for seniors and persons with disabilities. So the funding streams and the missions of those housing providers that are using those subsidies can affect who is targeted and who is served by those particular units. But we know that across Virginia, we have an age wave coming, or it's already here, with the large boomer population retiring and entering into kind of their last decades with us. And so we know that those housing needs are going to change and increase as those folks retire and look to downsize and maybe transition into fixed income. So that's what's going on the rental side, or just a little bit, but let's talk about home ownership and home ownership opportunities now. It is not easy right now to buy a home in Virginia. So this is looking at the state median sales price and the median months of supply at the state level. And so these two things are directly related. It is a supply and demand issue. We have the cost of housing, the cost to purchase a home has gone up significantly, even just over the past few years. And despite a short kind of stall or pause in the market due to COVID in the spring and early summer, the housing market is roaring back, and there is a huge pent-up demand for home ownership. And so, because we still have a huge demand and the supply is dwindling, both literally, and because people are probably still a little hesitant to put their homes on the market until everybody's fully vaccinated and there are truly safe and trusted procedures to sell your home, we are down close to just 1 month of inventory across the state. And so a really crazy stat that I heard just yesterday was that here in Virginia, there are about twice as many real estate agents as there are homes listed for sale right now. So there are 2 real estate agents, 2 realtors for every home on the market, which is just incredible to think about. And so we are really in a remarkable situation when it comes to the for sale market in Virginia. So looking at the Valley right now, so each of those lines is one of the different localities in the Valley. I didn't label them just because it would get a little bit too confusing. So just looking at the big picture, the Valley are seeing the exact same trends at the state level, even more acutely. So home prices are going up on average well into the 300s, and the month supply has gone from close to a year's worth of supply, maybe 6 years ago in 2014 and 2015, all the way down to a month or less in some places. And so we're entering into the spring selling market in the summer. And so people are really going to start feeling the crunch. And I know here in Richmond, at least, that story is the same. Tons of offers on every single house that's going up for sale. And, unless you write a sob story or have a connection with that buyer, you're going to have a tough time, getting the keys to that house. So we are in a really remarkable point in time for the homeownership market in Virginia. So what's going on? How did we get here? Just like in the rental market, we have a very low supply compared to the demand for home ownership. We have historically low interest rates. Everybody's thought that they might go up at some point. They're still very low. So it's very cheap money out there to purchase homes with. Localities for a long time have not been zoning for denser, less expensive homes like townhomes, smaller starter homes, especially in a lot of suburban localities across the state. Localities, most of the land that is zoned for development, or where localities are allowing rezonings to happen, they're very hesitant to increase density, and so we still see large lots. And we kind of have the hangover from the building boom in the 90s and early 2000s or a lot of larger homes. And that stock really just isn't matching perfectly with what the market is demanding right now. We have retirees looking to downsize and millennials looking to buy smaller homes that are closer to amenities and maybe aren't that large because maybe millennials aren't looking to start a huge family right now. And so the stock out there, not only there's only a little bit of it, and it's not always matching what buyers are wanting. And so you get a lot of people searching and trying to find the same type of home, and that type of home is really tough to find across the state. And generally speaking, again, this kind of bifurcation of opportunity in the housing market is that we really haven't seen the homeowner class and white collar workers and people who have a very good wage and good savings have been insulated from the worst of the pandemic. The pandemic really affected service workers, the essential workers, and people who were on the front lines. And those people generally were renting and are continuing to rent. And so we see kind of inequality exacerbated, just like with any shock to the system, a non-resilient market that hasn't planned ahead, we're going to see inequalities and opportunities continue to diverge from one another between the haves and the folks who don't have anything or are struggling. And so another effect of the pandemic has been supply chain and cost issues. The price of lumber has gone through the roof. Labor is very hard to find or getting more expensive. It's hard to find contractors. That was already an issue before COVID. Tariffs from the previous administration made increased cost of lumber and other materials as well. And so it's really just the perfect storm of it being very difficult to find a home, and it's also difficult for the market to produce homes that are going to tamp down on this demand and try to blow off some steam a little bit. So let's transition and talk about the pandemic some more. And I'm going to share some of the findings and things that we heard from nonprofit housing providers, both in the housing production space, rental and homeownership, as well as the homelessness sector in the greater Richmond region. So first of all, when it comes to their delivery of services and their mission and programs and how they are conducting their workflows, it was a very mixed response, a set of responses. On the homelessness side, lots of scaling up to meet the current demand and to get people off the streets into safer situations. And really this succeeded initially due to unprecedented collaboration among different providers. And so I'm very interested to hear you all about how this might have happened in the Valley, or what you all saw in the first few weeks and months of the pandemic. On the rental and home ownership side, we saw strategic retreats of services, pulling back until more guidance or more PPE was received, trying to adapt certain programs and just planning for this long-term uncertainty about what is our world going to look like in the next few weeks, let alone in 12 months. And so it's very much been kind of a wait and see approach, plan for the next month, and then just see as additional guidance, additional funding comes down the pipe, and just keep trudging forward a little bit by little bit incrementally. So overall, everybody said, we're doing okay right now, but we are trying to pivot to the crisis after the crisis. Nobody knows when the eviction moratorium is going to end. The federal funding situation was still unknown at this point. This is kind of late spring, early summer last year when we talked to these folks. Nobody knows what the local and state budgets are going to look like. So everybody was just on edge. They were okay where they were. They had kind of reached a level of coping, but there was just huge uncertainty about the future. So the overall impact was that homelessness providers served many more clients than normal. It wasn't easy going, but they saw a huge increase in demand, but they also were able to scale up to meet most of that need. The providers of affordable homeownership, like our Habitat affiliate and other similar organizations that do construction or rehab repair, they were forced to retreat. But I think by now they have really come back online. A lot of those folks have been vaccinated since they fell into some of the early phases of vaccination, and they figured out how to do their mission pretty well and safely. And then on the rental side, things kind of stayed stagnant. People stopped doing lease ups in their special needs or affordable rental properties. And so it's just kind of monitoring and making sure that their tenants, especially those that are at high risk in senior or elderly rental properties, that they were safe, that they had access to PPE and eventually vaccinations. So here's a kind of a flow diagram of what happened here in Richmond in the first few months of the pandemic in terms of getting persons experiencing homelessness off of the street into shelters, and ideally into permanent housing options. So out of the slightly over 400 people that were placed into motels or non-congregate shelters in those first kind of 8 to 10 weeks, about 2/3 of those were able to leave. And the majority of those went into, good destinations or places where providers and social workers could track those outcomes and give those people better, get them into more stable housing opportunities. Unfortunately, there was a not insignificant amount of people who left this system and, are continuing to struggle with chronic homelessness. So it has been really difficult, I think, in the long term for our homelessness providers to deal with, increased scrutiny from the public, from policymakers, from elected officials, and those people not really understanding how the system was set up to work in the first place and how the system has adapted. And so I think it's been very challenging and very taxing on the homelessness providers to do their job. But I think overall, they, at least around here, rose to the occasion and are doing the best that they can given the resources and guidance that they have. Internally, with workforce and payroll, thankfully, our organization saw very limited layoffs and furloughs. In fact, some of these organizations, especially on the homelessness side, scaled up with some of that initial money that flowed down from the federal government. Nearly everybody got a PPP award. That was really indicative of the community banking relationships that these nonprofits have. A lot of creative adaptations to remote work, especially in those early days, as I bet a lot of you experienced for firsthand. Lots of stress and lots of concern about exposure early on before we really knew how this virus transmitted. And, do we need to wash our hands every 30 seconds? How many masks do we need to wear? Is it okay to touch my groceries? Just a lot of uncertainty early on led to a lot of stress. And we saw a lot of organizations trying to provide their staff with hazard pay or flexible time off just to give people the chance to recharge and show appreciation for, what they have been doing on the front lines. And so our private philanthropic funders here have been very interested in that and making sure that on the operations and staff level, those people feel supported as they are, helping vulnerable people across the region with their housing situations. On the financial side, again, most organizations felt very confident that they will overcome the pandemic in the short term, primarily due to PPP, operational reserves that they had, and emergency funding that came down from the first and second tranches of federal assistance and some emergency philanthropic support that was provided here in Richmond. But again, there was this huge focus on, okay, we're fine now. I don't know what to tell my staff and my board about, a year from now. It's just, there's too much uncertainty. Concern about donor fatigue, lower corporate giving, if there's a long-term recession, and again, this impact on state and local budgets, which I think has not been as bad, at least at the state level, as some people expected. And so while there is a lot of funding that has come down from the CARES Act and then now through the the most recent American Rescue Plan. There's concern about flexibility and, for example, FEMA dollars for getting persons experiencing homelessness into shelter. That funding is on a reimbursement basis, and so from a cash flow perspective, that's very tough for some organizations. They need money up front to pay the hotels, to pay for food, and to get people into good situations. And so sometimes the structure and guidelines of that funding just isn't making things very simple. And so, but really the number one thing that we heard from folks is that we are going to need widespread rental and foreclosure assistance for when the policy interventions and moratoria expire, because there's going to be a backlog of rent and mortgage payments. And unless we think about that in the entire food chain, both the people living in their homes and landlords and the lenders and the people holding those loans, there has to be some sort of comprehensive approach to make sure our entire system doesn't fall apart. But most importantly, make sure people stay safely and securely housed in their homes if we can do that. And then on the health side, for client health, at least when we first talked to people, there were major unknowns about the persons that they were serving, what their health was early on. There was just no systematic way to track how people were doing, except for really in shelters when providers were face-to-face or in very close proximity to the people that they were serving. And so this is both physical health and emotional and mental health as well. There were concerns across that entire health spectrum. We saw concerns about, the ability for persons who need mental health treatments. How can they get those services and transition to, virtual provision of those services, especially for people that may not be very technology fluent on both sides of that equation. What happens when we have persons who are experiencing domestic violence stuck in their homes due to quarantine? How can we ensure that people in those precarious situations are effectively have effective outs for dangerous situations that they may be in? And so what are the ripple effects if we have to defer treatment, both for their people's physical health and mental health? And so there's a lot of concern about this kind of long-term effects on the health outcomes of the people within and the clients and people within the housing system. And then on the staff side, the CEOs and the EDs that we talked to said a lot about they wanted to make sure that their staff were okay from a mental health and wellness perspective. I think that was predominantly the case for people kind of on the back end, doing the administrative tasks, trying to deal with increased funding that's coming in from private and public sources, trying to allocate that funding in the right way, analyzing programs, all of that back end support infrastructure that's so critical. But then also the people who are literally on the front lines, helping people get into shelters or checking on people in rental properties. Those frontline staff were extremely worried about infection, primarily because there were huge uncertainties and deficiencies in the supply of PPE early on. And so, because there were no common sources, donations weren't consistent, you could get tons of gloves and maybe hand sanitizer, but you wouldn't have masks. And so that, coupled with just that initial uncertainty about how this virus transmitted throughout people and throughout the community, just led to a lot of elevated blood pressure and heart rates and concern among housing providers. That thankfully has, I think, leveled out as we've kind of settled into this unfortunate new normal, but that was a huge issue early on. So that's what we heard in Richmond from providers, but now I'll spend the next couple of minutes talking about what's happening at the state capitol and what policymakers have been up to for the past couple of years. So back in 2020, a couple of big things that happened then. We saw source of income protection for renters finally get passed. That had been proposed for a number of years and never made it through both houses. It was finally adopted by the General Assembly and signed by the governor. This prohibits discrimination against potential renters based on where they're getting their income to pay for their rent. And so this is really critical for recipients of housing choice vouchers, but also applies for persons on other fixed income sources like SSI and other assistance. So that's huge. And so the guidance and the effects of that are still TBD, but we know that was a huge hurdle to clear. There were also changes to the state code that allows for localities across Virginia to adopt voluntary inclusionary zoning or affordable dwelling unit ordinances. It gives additional guidance and options and a little bit more of a prescribed approach for localities to do that. So it'll be interesting to see which localities explore this option in the next few years. And then what I am most involved with right now is a statewide housing study created by House Bill 854. And so I'll talk about that now. So this bill directed DHCD and VHDA to conduct a statewide housing study. It establishes a stakeholder advisory group of about now a little over 30 people of housing experts and practitioners from across the state to conduct this study in conjunction with Virginia Housing, DHCD, and Housing Forward. We have been brought in to serve as kind of the quarterback for this whole process and assist with the research and policy work in partnership with our state agencies. So the final report later on will be the product of this stakeholder advisory group. And you can see some of the text of the bill that outline the types of persons and experts that were recruited to serve on this group. So the bill says, stakeholders, you need to consider and look at these things. You need to determine the quantity and quality of affordable housing and workforce housing across the state. You need to review current programs and policies and figure out how effective they are. You need to develop an informed projection of housing needs across the state and determine how to prioritize those needs. And you need to make some recommendations to go back to the General Assembly and the governor's administration about what to do based on those needs, what's working, what isn't working, and how housing policy should change to meet those needs. It also says we want you to evaluate some specific policy initiatives that don't really exist at a comprehensive level in the state. The first of which would be a rental assistance program that would work in conjunction with the federal housing choice voucher program. Virginia has some very small scale permanent supportive housing oriented state rental assistance programs, but we do not have a true companion tenant-based or project-based rental assistance program in the state. And so it asks this group to look at options, look at what other states are doing, and come up with some recommendations for that. It also asks us to look at lowering utility burdens for affordable housing, looking at how property taxes can be reduced for affordable housing, and looking at how the state or localities could increase their bond capacity to support affordable housing development and construction. So it's a lot of different things that this bill asks us to look at, both on the data side and on the policy side. So this bill was originally passed right before 2020 changed in a lot of different ways. And so we, in conjunction with DHCD and Virginia Housing, agreed that both COVID and racial inequity in housing must be considered as major themes within this work, because if this bill were to have been drafted and passed later on in 2020, these two things would have been included in that text. And so throughout this process, we are looking at everything that I just described through both of these lenses, which I think is really, really important. So without going into too much detail, basically the scope of work for this is to analyze current housing programs and policies. We had a huge survey that went out last year and in January to providers across the Commonwealth. Some of you probably took that survey to understand how you currently use and digest housing programs across the state and figure out what's working and what isn't. We also conducted a lot of focus groups around this. So that's kind of, opening the hood and seeing how programs are currently working in the state and how they might need to be improved. The second one is analyzing those particular policy initiatives that I mentioned around the state rent subsidy program, utility rate reductions, bond financing, those things. So look at best practices from other states, look at what is maybe currently happening in the state, what can we learn from, and what might the potential impacts and policy needs might be for each of those. The third piece in pink is the big data piece. So looking at trying to quantify how much housing we have, where is it currently meeting demand, where are the gaps in that housing across the state in terms of supply and demand, what condition is it in, both in terms of affordability and age, and projecting out what those needs might be over the next decade or two. And then finally, we need to do something with all of this, right? So this is the biggest unknown at this point, but we know that we need to deliver a product to the General Assembly and to policymakers that they can understand and interpret easily. But we also know that we want to use this as an educational tool to the public to have them understand what housing challenges currently exist across the state and what are some pathways, some exit ramps that we can go down in the future to solve some of these issues. So how is all of this happening, and when can you expect to see something about all of this work? So we are in the midst of it right now. We have completed some focus groups in the survey. We are combing through those hundreds and hundreds of responses, trying to synthesize all of that. The stakeholder group has broken into subgroups to begin having conversations and learning about those different policy areas, rental subsidy, utility rate reductions. We're talking to the SCC. We're talking to experts from other states that run similar programs. And so we are just absorbing as much as we can right now so that during the summer, we can create some policy recommendations, begin to frame out what this report might look like, and then in early fall, really have a product that is finally delivered to lawmakers, to policymakers, and to the public. So stay tuned. This is a lot of what I'm doing, pretty much all I'm doing for the next 6 months or so. But I'm really excited. I think this is a great opportunity for the state to really take a deep dive into its housing needs and how effective its current programs are in meeting those needs, and what innovations can we advance in order to really increase housing opportunity for everybody moving into this next decade. So how are we going to try to answer those questions? We need to figure out what needs are being met, what programs need changes. Maybe they just need more funding to meet demand and they're working really well. Which programs are maybe fully antiquated and need to get rolled into something else. Or maybe we need to change the targeting or the eligibility guidelines for them. And then are there any new programs that need to get created, maybe that other states are doing that would really meet a need well here in Virginia? And we know that the regional and local role in this is super important when it comes to land use and actual delivery of a lot of these programs and a lot of this money that's coming down the pipe. So what are the capacity issues for providers? What barriers need to get removed or chipped away at the local level? And so we're trying to wrap our head around the entire supply chain involved in the provision of housing services and housing production that the state has a hand in across the Commonwealth. So there's going to be a lot of content, I think, that we eventually release. But again, I think this is a really great opportunity, and look forward to sharing a lot of the recommendations and findings from this report later this year. Other things happening at the state level, just in the past few months. We saw what's known as an anti-NIMBY bill get passed. This was patroned by Jeff Bourne from the Richmond, who serves most of Richmond in the House. It adds a section to fair housing law at the state level that prohibits localities from denying permits to housing projects that would be occupied primarily by low-income households. It's still yet to be seen how this will be really enforced or how localities will treat this, so stay tuned to this. There was also another bill that came out of the House that directs DHCD to create a study group to look very deeply at accessory dwelling units and figure out how localities can support ADUs in people's backyards and what state resources might be necessary to create more accessory dwelling units. And then the most important thing I think that came out of this session is the Virginia Housing Opportunity Tax Credit. So this establishes a state housing tax credit companion to the federal LIHTC program. It's a $15 million allocation per year, which currently matches half of the current allocation we get from the federal program. This is a really big deal. This is a BFD. I don't think lawmakers truly understand what they approved and how much of a tax credit this is. But this is really going to be a game changer for affordable rental housing production in the Commonwealth over the next decade, and then even longer, assuming it gets re-upped later on in the future. So we know that this is going to have huge impacts, mostly or entirely great, but we don't know really how developers and how Virginia Housing, as it begins to roll out this tax credit, how it's going to be utilized. Is it going to deepen the affordability of units that are proposed using the federal tax credit? That's one possibility. Or is it just going to expand the number of units without really deepening the affordability levels established by the federal tax credit program? That's yet to be seen. That is not explicitly enumerated in the bill. So I think, again, stay tuned. I think over the next year or two, we'll really begin to understand how tax credit developers and our State Housing Finance Agency are going to see this new resource getting deployed and integrated into the rest of our affordable housing development system. So that was a lot. And so I'll leave you with a couple of really important things that I think are critical to take away. Number one, we have tremendously segregated opportunities in today's housing market, both in terms of tenure for low-income renters and for homeowners, and even first-time home buyers that are looking to not rent anymore. They can't find a home. And so, but if you're selling a home, you're in a really great position. It is a seller's market. So we have segregated, bifurcated opportunity in our market today. And without intervention, things are going to get worse. If we don't take a comprehensive approach to supporting renters as an eviction moratorium ends, we are going to put a tremendous strain on not just our housing resources, but the rest of our social service resources. We cannot let that happen, or we are going to be overtaxed and we are going to have a really bad situation. And same with the homeownership side. If we don't create more lower cost, affordable homeownership opportunities, we are going to see existing homeowners build more equity and get more opportunity, and we're going to have a class of people who are very close to homeownership be locked out for an entire generation. Housing providers are doing a really great job in the pandemic. They are dealing with a lot of incredible challenges, especially on the homelessness side. And so we need to continue to support them in terms of operations, their capacity, and politically. We need to make sure that local officials, elected officials, understand what our housing providers are doing and understand what needs they have in order to continue their mission and expand their mission. We need to take advantage of this increased awareness and attention paid to housing and affordable housing at the state level. This is a really, really great moment to educate, to speak to your state senator, your delegate, and tell them why housing is important to you, because that conversation is growing and expanding and resources are becoming much greater at the state level. And so now is the time to have this conversation with your elected officials at the state level. And finally, at the local level, localities need to grease the wheel to make housing a priority, or all of the tremendous levels of housing assistance that are coming down through the CARES Act, through the American Recovery, whatever the ARP, whatever that was, I'm losing track of all these different packages, but all of the federal money coming down the pipe for housing rehab, utility assistance, all this great stuff. The new state housing tax credit program, which is tens of millions of dollars over the next few years, hundreds of millions of dollars over the next decade. If localities don't allow affordable housing developers and providers to use those funds by keeping their zoning exclusionary and restrictive, and by not supporting these providers, all that money is going to go to waste. And so localities play a really critical role in making sure that all of this great stuff that's happening in other points in the in the system is deployed effectively and equitably. So that was a lot. I think we have some time for questions, but I would love to continue follow-up conversations via email or otherwise. But I'll turn it back over to Nadine to maybe facilitate some questions here now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know there was one in the chat. I think it was from the slide that you shared about housing production within the different counties. I think I can't remember what slide that was. It was early on. It was, yeah, that one. Is data from Clark County missing, or did it drop off the way that it appears?
So yeah, so a word of caution about interpreting this graph, and I couldn't figure it out in the designer that I was making. But when a line or kind of the area ends, it doesn't mean that those homes went away. It was just that was the last year of production where any homes were created. So I couldn't figure out a way to make that line continue flat horizontally. So that's a data visualization error on my part. But no, we haven't seen those homes just magically disappear overnight. It just means that there has been no more production of assisted rental units wherever that line stopped in that locality.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And if you've got questions for John, I don't have no more in the chat, but now that we're done, if you've got further questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or I believe you have the power to unmute yourself. So you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask Jonathan if you have any questions. I guess I'll start off. I know sometimes what's happening in Richmond feels overwhelming to smaller organizations. What's your advice in terms of what's the best way to stay up to date on changes that could affect housing affordability and the production of affordable housing locally? And how do we as smaller agencies know what we can take advantage of and maybe what is for, maybe sometimes the larger ones? Sometimes we get it's probably not for us type thing, but what's your advice in terms of us keeping up to date and feeling like we can really go for some of these options and make some change here?
That's a great question. So I guess I'll say first that our organization tries to be intentional when we have the time and capacity to do outreach to the non-metro areas across the state. A few years ago, actually, one of the first projects that I worked with was a rural housing initiative where we, went in the car and drove around and had town halls and listened to the needs of rural housing providers and practitioners across the state. And there's a report on our website about that. And I really enjoyed that. And I love going around to different parts of the state and getting out of the city and talking to folks. And that was, as I kind of began my work here in the housing field, that was really important to make sure I, try to keep myself out of the bubble. We definitely don't do a perfect job of that. So I would love for our organization to, coming out of COVID, do more work in rural areas and getting the messaging out. And I think our board, which is made up of a pretty geographically diverse set of folks, recognizes that. And I think we hope to do more work in other parts of the state outside of the urban crescent in 2021. So that's kind of my overall context. But I will say immediately the things that you can do. This sounds a little self-serving, but sign up on our mailing list if you haven't already. We send out a weekly kind of microblog about things happening in the state or elsewhere. We do a newsletter occasionally, and we obviously hold events and webinars throughout the year. The other organizations that I would recommend, there's probably a number that I'm forgetting, but the two that I can think of would be the Virginia Housing Alliance. They have a mailing list that you can get on. They are the primary advocacy vehicle in the state. And so they, following the General Assembly session this year, sent out a big debrief about, what the results of the, policies and the budget were. They had updates during the special sessions last year. So in terms of understanding and knowing about what bills are being considered and what, made it to the finish line, the Virginia Housing Alliance is going to be a great resource. And then in terms of fair housing and impacts on tenants and homeowners, Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia, which is based here in Richmond, but works in many places across the state. They were the primary organization that really focused on the source of income protections and fair housing laws. So any laws or regulations about that, they would be the best resource for. There's other groups, the Home Builders of Virginia, the Virginia Realtors, depending on your interest, just sign up on mailing lists. I know we have too many emails in our inboxes these days, but that's the best way. And then finally, just send us an email or pick up the phone and call me or call any of my colleagues. We love talking to people from across the state and fielding questions. So we really try to be very approachable. So please feel free to interrupt my day anytime.
That's great. Thank you. And Kim Herbstreit put in the chat, for those of you that are on this and may have further interest, the Housing Coalition does have a policy committee. So if you're interested in working on advocacy and some of these policy and systems, that's certainly a place where maybe we can get Jonathan to come back in 6 to 9 months or, whenever this work is moving along and get some updates in a smaller group. And I know that group will be on a lot of those email lists and be able to distribute a lot of that information. So thank you for that. And Kimberly will put in the link to that rural housing study you mentioned. So thank you. Great. Are there any other questions? Kim Herbstreit, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask or add?
I don't, other than just thank you, Jonathan. This was, I think, extremely informative, and to be able to kind of break down the data and get a better picture of kind of what we're dealing with here in the Northern Shenandoah Valley. And I think this slide that you have up right here, I mean, certainly all the other slides, but this slide you have up here, I mean, it just speaks to, the need for, getting more certainly rental housing in the Valley, but also, home ownership. And we're behind in that. And there's just so much work that needs to be done. So thank you.
No, I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation. And hopefully this is just kind of the start of a conversation and, lets you all ask some questions and move forward as the day goes on. But yeah, please, my email is on our website, but there it is in case you need to jot it down. And, I never have, or I never always have the answer to a question, but thankfully, I generally know who has the answer. So I'm always happy to refer people to the actual experts on a particular policy or data question. That's definitely our role here in Richmond, is to make sure people are connected to the right folks.
Great. Thanks again, Jonathan. I really appreciate your presentation and your time today and helping us get connected. I know you connected us with a few other speakers for later this afternoon. So thanks again.